The town of Ashgrove had long been a place where the past lingered just beneath the surface, like a whisper in the wind that never quite fades. Nestled in a forgotten corner of the countryside, it was a place where stories were passed down from generation to generation, growing darker and more twisted with each retelling. Yet none were as chilling as the tale of the Ashgrove Cinema. Once the pride of the town, the cinema had opened its doors in the roaring 1920s, a grand Art Deco palace that promised glamour and escapism. It stood at the heart of Main Street, with its marquee lights shining bright and its velvet seats filled with eager patrons. But all of that came to a tragic end one stormy night in 1933 when a fire broke out during a sold-out screening. The blaze spread quickly, fueled by old film reels and heavy drapes. In the chaos, the doors jammed, trapping everyone inside. By morning, the once grand building was reduced to a charred husk, and the town was left with the loss of dozens of lives. For decades, the ruins of the Ashgrove Cinema were left untouched, a grim monument to the town's darkest hour. Some claimed to hear the sounds of a projector whirring late at night or catch a glimpse of shadowy figures moving behind the cracked windows. Others spoke of cold spots that lingered even in the height of summer and a pervasive scent of smoke that never seemed to fade. But as time wore on, the old tales were buried under layers of modern life, and the site of the cinema was eventually cleared away, replaced with a parking lot that no one used. That is, until the year 1974, when a young entrepreneur named Richard Hayes decided to bring the cinema back to life. Richard was not from Ashgrove. He had no connection to the town's past, nor any belief in the ghost stories that circulated among the locals. To him, the site was a prime piece of real estate, perfect for the retro revival cinema he had always dreamed of opening. With a keen eye for business and a head full of nostalgia for the golden age of Hollywood, he bought the land at a bargain price and began construction. The new cinema was a modern marvel with a sleek, minimalist design that paid homage to its Art Deco predecessor. But it wasn't just a building, it was a promise. A promise to restore the town's former glory and to bring people together once more, just as the original cinema had done. As the grand reopening approached, Ashgrove was alive with excitement. For weeks, the small town had been buzzing with anticipation. Flyers had been plastered on every telephone pole, and radio ads extolled the return of a night at the movies, Ashgrove style. The marquee had been restored to its former brilliance, lighting up Main Street like a beacon of hope. But beneath the surface, there was unease. The town's elders, those who remembered the fire or had grown up hearing about it, were less enthusiastic. They warned Richard of the site's cursed history, of the restless spirits that were said to haunt the ground where the cinema once stood. But Richard, ever the pragmatist, dismissed their concerns as nothing more than old superstitions. "I'm not in the business of ghosts," he would say with a chuckle. "I'm in the business of entertainment." Still, the night of the grand reopening was a spectacle. The cinema was packed with families, couples, and curious teenagers, all eager to experience the new venue. The smell of freshly popped popcorn filled the air, mingling with the excitement that buzzed through the crowd. The first film on the docket was a classic, a black-and-white thriller from the 1930s, chosen as a tribute to the cinema's original era. As the lights dimmed and the projector hummed to life, a collective hush fell over the audience. The film flickered onto the screen, its grainy images transporting the viewers back in time. But just as the first scene began to play, something strange happened. The screen flickered, not in the way that old films sometimes do, but with an unnatural rhythm, as if the projector itself were struggling to stay in sync. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, murmuring softly, Richard, who was seated in the back, frowned and made a note to check the equipment after the show. But then the flickering stopped, and the film resumed as normal. The tension in the room eased, and soon the audience was engrossed in the story unfolding before them. But Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He glanced around the theater, his eyes drawn to the corners of the room where the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. The air was cool, too cool for a summer night, and there was an odd smell, faint but unmistakable, like smoke mingled with something older, mustier. As the film progressed, Richard's unease grew. He found himself glancing up at the projection room, where the light from the projector flickered steadily. He couldn't see inside, but for a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing behind the glass, a dark silhouette watching the crowd. He blinked, and it was gone. The film ended without further incident, and the audience filed out, chattering excitedly about the experience. But as the last of the patrons left, Richard stood alone in the empty theater, staring up at the screen. The smell of smoke lingered, stronger now, as if something, or someone, had been disturbed by the night's events. Outside, the neon lights of the marquee buzzed faintly, casting an eerie glow over the empty street. Richard took one last look at the darkened cinema before locking up, the uneasy feeling still gnawing at the back of his mind. As he walked away, the wind picked up, carrying with it a soft, almost imperceptible sound, the distant whir of an old projector, playing a reel that hadn't been touched in over 40 years. The ghostly whispers had begun. The next day dawned gray and overcast, casting a somber tone over the town of Ashgrove. Richard Hayes arrived at the cinema early, eager to investigate the odd occurrences from the previous night. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying the strange flickering on the screen and the fleeting shadow in the projection room. Dismissing it as a simple technical glitch wasn't enough. There was something about the whole experience that gnawed at him, something that felt deeply, inexplicably wrong. Inside the cinema, the air was still cool, the kind of chill that seemed to seep into your bones. Richard walked through the empty lobby, his footsteps echoing off the polished floor. The smell of popcorn from the night before had faded, but the faint odor of smoke lingered, as if the walls had absorbed it. He made his way to the projection room, determined to find a rational explanation. The equipment was brand new, installed by professionals, and there had been no reason for it to malfunction. Yet as he climbed the narrow staircase, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to deepen around him, clinging to the walls in a way that made him feel like he was being watched. The door to the projection room creaked as he pushed it open. The space was small and cramped, dominated by the massive projector that had once been the heart of the cinema. The new digital system was sleek and efficient, a far cry from the old, hulking machines that used to be housed here. Yet, as Richard stood in the doorway, he could almost hear the faint whir of film running through the reels, as if the ghost of the old projector was still alive, still working. He shook off the thought and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single small window that looked out over the auditorium. Richard approached the projector, running his hand along its smooth surface. There were no obvious signs of malfunction, no loose wires or faulty connections. Everything appeared to be in perfect working order, but as he examined the controls, a sudden chill ran down his spine. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the room. For a moment, he was certain he saw something out of the corner of his eye, a flicker of movement in the shadows. He held his breath, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing. The room was silent, the only noise the faint hum of the digital equipment. Richard let out a slow breath, shaking his head at his own nerves. "Get a grip, Richard," he muttered to himself. "There's nothing here." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. Downstairs, the cinema's staff began to arrive, their chatter filling the lobby with life once more. Richard forced himself to focus on the tasks at hand, pushing the strange incidents from his mind. There were tickets to sell, movies to schedule, and a whole day of business ahead. Yet, as the hours passed, the sense of unease grew. The cinema was bustling with activity, but there was something off, something that hung in the air like a dark cloud. Patrons complained of strange drafts in the auditorium, even though the air conditioning was off. Some said they felt a presence behind them, turning only to find empty seats. Others mentioned a flickering at the edges of the screen, like shadows moving just out of sight. By mid-afternoon, rumors began to spread. Some said the cinema was haunted, that the ghosts of those who had died in the fire had returned. Others claimed to have seen figures in the projection room, shadowy shapes that disappeared when approached. Richard dismissed these stories as the product of overactive imaginations, but as the day wore on, the occurrences became harder to ignore. That evening, the cinema filled up once more for the last showing of the day. The feature film was a modern horror flick, a choice that now seemed a little too on the nose given the unsettling atmosphere. Richard was in his office, going over receipts, when he heard the first scream. He bolted upright, his heart pounding in his chest. The scream was followed by another, then another, rising into a cacophony of panic. Richard raced to the auditorium, pushing through the doors just as the lights flickered violently. The film had frozen on the screen, the image of a terrified woman staring back at the audience. But it wasn't the film that had caused the panic. It was what was happening in the aisles. Figures moved through the rows of seats, dark shapes barely distinguishable in the flickering light. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, acrid and choking. Patrons scrambled to their feet, trying to flee, but the shadows seemed to move with them, closing in like a living thing. Richard's blood ran cold as he saw what they were fleeing from. The shadows weren't just flickers of light. They were solid, human-shaped figures, with faces contorted in agony and anger. They moved through the crowd, reaching out with hands that seemed to pass through flesh, leaving only icy cold in their wake. One of the figures passed right by Richard, its hollow eyes locking onto his for a brief, heart-stopping moment. It was then that he understood. These were the spirits of those who had died in the fire, trapped between worlds, their rage and pain still smoldering after all these years. In the chaos, Richard's mind raced. He had to do something, anything, to stop this. He needed to get everyone out of the building, but the exit doors were jammed, just like on that fateful night so long ago. The terror in the room was palpable, feeding the malevolent spirits that now prowled the cinema. Desperation took hold as Richard pushed his way through the terrified crowd toward the projection room. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that something had to be done. The screams of the patrons echoed in his ears, mingling with the unnatural sounds of the spirits, cries of anguish, of despair that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. As he burst into the projection room, the old whirring sound returned, louder now, almost deafening. The digital projector was off, but the room was filled with the ghostly noise of an old reel spinning, the shadows of the past playing out once more. Richard fell to his knees, his hands over his ears, as the room seemed to spin around him. The ghosts were all around him now, their forms flickering in and out of view, as if trapped in the endless loop of that tragic night. "Why?" Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "Why won't you leave?" But there was no answer, only the relentless whir of the phantom projector and the cold touch of the shadows as the past and present collided in a terrifying, inescapable nightmare. Richard was shaken to his core. The events of the previous night had left him haunted, not just by what he had seen, but by the overwhelming sense of dread that now seemed to seep into every corner of the cinema. The images of those shadowy figures, the trapped souls who had died in the fire, were burned into his mind. No matter how much he tried to rationalize it, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had disturbed something that should have been left alone. But there was no time to dwell on his fear. The cinema had to open for business, and the show had to go on. Yet, as Richard arrived at the cinema the next morning, he noticed something strange. Every member of his staff had called in sick. Each excuse was more vague than the last. A bad cold, a stomach bug, just not feeling well today. Richard knew better. They were scared. The whispers of what had happened last night had already spread through town, and no one wanted to be caught in the cinema's grip again. Determined to keep things running, Richard decided to handle the day's operations himself. He was confident that whatever had happened was a fluke, a one-time event that wouldn't repeat. Still, a heavy weight pressed on him as he moved through the silent, empty corridors of the cinema. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As he unlocked the projection room door, a cold draft swept past him, causing him to shiver despite the summer heat outside. The room was dark and quiet, the new digital projector sitting idle. Richard hesitated at the threshold, his heart pounding in his chest. He could still hear the ghostly whirring of the old projector in his mind, the sound that had nearly driven him mad the night before. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the small, cluttered space. Everything looked normal, no sign of the shadows that had plagued him. He moved to the control panel, checking the settings. Everything was in perfect working order, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. Richard's gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where an old, dusty curtain hung limply against the wall. It seemed out of place amidst the modern equipment, a relic from another time. He had never noticed it before. Hesitant, but driven by a strange compulsion, he crossed the room and pulled the curtain aside. Behind it was an old door, one that didn't appear on any of the building's plans. The wood was aged and cracked, the paint peeling away to reveal a dark, almost black surface beneath. Richard's heart raced as he reached for the handle, his fingers trembling slightly. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire cinema, reverberating off the walls like a ghostly moan. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase, descending into darkness. A cold, musty smell wafted up from below, a mix of damp earth and something far more unpleasant, something that smelled like decay. Richard hesitated, every instinct telling him to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But the pull of the unknown was too strong, the need to understand what was happening overpowering his fear. He descended the stairs, each step creaking beneath his weight. The darkness closed in around him, the narrow walls seeming to press closer with every step. He felt as though he were descending into the very heart of the cinema, into a place that had been forgotten by time itself. At the bottom of the stairs, Richard found himself in a small, windowless room. It was filled with old film reels, stacked haphazardly on rusting shelves. The air was thick with dust, and Richard coughed as he waved it away from his face. In the center of the room, sitting on a rotting wooden table, was an old film projector. It was an ancient model, far older than anything that should have been in the cinema, its metal frame tarnished and worn. Yet, as Richard approached, He saw that it was still functional, its parts carefully maintained despite the decay around it. The projector was threaded with a film reel, the old brittle celluloid curled tightly on the spool. Richard reached out to touch it, but as his fingers brushed against the film, a sudden chill shot through him, freezing him in place. The room seemed to darken, the shadows deepening until they became almost solid, and then, from the corner of the room, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone breathing. Richard spun around, his heart in his throat, but the room was empty. The only sound was his own ragged breathing, echoing off the stone walls. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was there with him, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. He turned back to the projector, his hands trembling as he reached for the switch. He hesitated, every nerve in his body screaming at him to stop, to leave this place before it was too late. But something inside him pushed forward, a morbid curiosity, a need to understand the forces at play in this cursed cinema. With a flick of the switch, the projector hummed to life, the ancient mechanisms creaking and groaning as they sprang into motion. The film began to play, the light flickering on the far wall as the images came to life. At first, the screen was blank, the film crackling with age. But slowly, the image came into focus, a grainy black and white scene of the Ash Grove cinema, just as it had been in the 1920s. Richard watched in horrified fascination as the scene played out before him. The cinema was bustling with life, the lobby filled with well-dressed patrons, the marquee lights shining bright against the night sky. But there was something wrong, something off about the way the figures moved, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and panic. As the camera panned across the crowd, Richard's breath caught in his throat. There, in the midst of the chaos, was a man, tall, thin, with a gaunt, haunted expression. He stood apart from the others, his eyes fixed on the camera as if he could see Richard watching him. The man's face was obscured by shadows, but there was something unmistakably familiar about him. Richard leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out the man's features. And then, the man smiled, a slow, sinister smile that sent a jolt of terror through Richard's heart. It was a smile that spoke of knowledge, of power, of a dark secret that had been buried beneath the ashes of the past. The film flickered, the image distorting as the projector struggled to keep pace. The man's figure wavered, then vanished entirely, replaced by a scene of roaring flames, the cinema engulfed in fire. The screen filled with smoke and shadows, the screams of the trapped patrons echoing through the small room. Richard stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to shut off the projector, but the switch wouldn't budge, as if it were frozen in place. The room grew colder, the shadows closing in around him, and Richard realized with a sickening certainty that he was not alone. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, slow, deliberate, growing closer with each passing second. Richard turned, his eyes wide with fear, and saw him, the man from the film, standing at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light, the phantom projectionist. Richard's breath caught in his throat as the man stepped forward, his presence filling the room with a suffocating dread. The projector continued to run, the film looping back to the start, showing the smiling man once again, his eyes locked on Richard's. The phantom projectionist reached out a hand, his fingers long and skeletal, and Richard felt the icy touch of death closing in around him. He couldn't move, couldn't scream, as the shadows swallowed him whole, dragging him down into the darkness. The last thing he saw was the man's smile, wide and cruel, as the cinema's secrets were finally revealed. The news of Richard Hayes's disappearance spread through Ashgrove like wildfire, igniting fear and speculation in every corner of the small town. The authorities searched the cinema from top to bottom, but there was no trace of him, no sign of struggle, no clues left behind. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The cinema was promptly closed, the marquee lights extinguished, and the doors padlocked. Yet, even as the building stood silent and dark, the unease in the town only grew. In the days that followed, the town's residents avoided Main Street altogether, steering clear of the cinema's looming presence. The whispers of the town elders grew louder, their warnings of the cursed site now carrying an air of grim vindication. The story of the Ashgrove Cinema was back on everyone's lips. No longer just a tale for the campfire, but a living nightmare. But the most troubling rumors were those that spoke of a cursed film reel, a relic of the old cinema that had been buried in the ashes of the fire and forgotten until now. The reel, some said, contained footage that was never meant to be seen, a record of the final moments before the fire consumed the building and everyone inside. The film was said to drive its viewers to madness, showing them not just the tragedy that had occurred, but something far darker, something that defied explanation. No one knew where the reel had come from or why it had been hidden away, but one thing was clear. The reel had resurfaced, and with it, the vengeful spirits that had once been trapped in celluloid were now free to roam the cinema once more. 1 week after Richard's disappearance, a group of teenagers, driven by equal parts curiosity and bravado, decided to break into the cinema. They had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in town had, but they were young, reckless, and eager for a thrill. The leader of the group, a boy named Tommy, had a particular fascination with urban legends and haunted places. He had convinced his friends that the rumors were just that. Rumors. What better way to prove it than to explore the supposedly haunted cinema for themselves? On a moonless night, they gathered outside the cinema armed with flashlights and a crowbar. The air was thick with the scent of rain, and the wind howled through the empty streets, but none of them dared to back out. They pried open the side door, which gave way with an eerie creak, and slipped inside. The interior of the cinema was pitch black, the silence oppressive. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing rows of empty seats covered in dust, the screen looming like a blank, lifeless eye. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable, as if the fire had never truly died out. "This place is creepy as hell," muttered Lisa, one of the girls in the group. Her voice echoed in the vast emptiness, making them all jump. "Relax," Tommy whispered back, though his own nerves were starting to fray. "It's just an old building. Nothing to be scared of." They made their way through the lobby, past the concession stand and up to the projection room, where the door hung slightly ajar. Tommy pushed it open, revealing the small, cluttered space. The air was colder here, the temperature dropping noticeably as they entered. The group huddled together, their flashlights casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. In the center of the room stood the old projector, its metal frame still intact despite years of neglect. But what caught Tommy's eye was the film reel sitting on the table beside it, dust-free and seemingly untouched by time. He picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The reel was old, the film inside brittle and yellowed with age, yet it seemed to pulse with a strange, almost malevolent energy. "Is this it?" asked Brian, another boy in the group, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Is this the cursed reel?" Tommy nodded, though he felt a deep unease settling in his stomach. He had thought it was all just a story, a bit of fun to scare each other with, but holding the reel now, he wasn't so sure. "Let's play it," Tommy said, trying to sound confident. "What's the worst that could happen?" The others exchanged nervous glances, but no one objected. They threaded the film through the old projector, their hands trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. As the projector sputtered to life, the beam of light flickered across the room, casting the first frames onto the dusty screen. The film was grainy and silent, the images shaky and poorly lit. It showed the interior of the Ashgrove Cinema, exactly as it had been before the fire. Patrons filing in, buying tickets, chatting excitedly as they found their seats. The camera was unsteady, as if held by an amateur, but the footage was strangely captivating, drawing them in despite the poor quality. But as the reel played on, the atmosphere in the room grew tense. The temperature dropped further, their breath now visible in the cold air. The shadows on the screen seemed to stretch and warp, the faces of the patrons blurring and distorting into grotesque masks of fear. The camera panned across the auditorium, and in every corner, there were flickering shapes, dark figures that shouldn't have been there, hovering just at the edge of the frame. "Turn it off," Lisa whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Tommy, turn it off." But Tommy couldn't move. He was transfixed, his eyes locked on the screen as the film continued to play. The camera zoomed in on the projection room, the very same room they were standing in now. The door on the screen creaked open, revealing the projectionist, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a sinister smile. He stared directly at the camera, his gaze piercing through the decades, as if he could see right into their souls. Tommy felt a cold hand on his shoulder, and he spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. But there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the other teenagers, who were now frozen in terror. The projector whirred loudly, the film spinning faster and faster, the images blurring into a chaotic whirl of light and shadow. The reel seemed to have a life of its own, refusing to stop even as the machine groaned under the strain. The room filled with the acrid smell of burning celluloid, smoke rising from the old projector. "Stop it! Turn it off!" Brian shouted, finally breaking free of his paralysis. He lunged for the projector, but the moment his hand touched it, he recoiled with a scream. His skin had blistered, as if he'd touched something red-hot, though the projector was cold to the touch. The image on the screen changed again, showing the fire as it raged through the cinema, consuming everything in its path. But there was something else in the flames, figures, ghostly and indistinct, moving through the inferno as if they were a part of it. The shadows reached out from the screen, stretching into the room, twisting and writhing as they sought to escape the confines of the film. The teenagers screamed as the shadows closed in, the temperature plummeting further until it felt like they were trapped in a freezer. The projector rattled violently, the film reel spinning out of control, the images on the screen distorting into nightmarish shapes. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the film stopped. The screen went black, the projector shuddering to a halt. The room was silent, the only sound the panicked breathing of the teenagers. For a moment, none of them moved, too stunned to react. Then, slowly, Tommy reached out and ejected the film reel, his hands shaking. The reel was hot to the touch, and he nearly dropped it as he placed it back on the table. "Let's get out of here," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. No one argued. They hurried down the stairs, their footsteps echoing through the dark, empty halls. But as they reached the lobby, the doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the walls, and the temperature dropped even further. The shadows were back, slithering across the floor and up the walls, moving with a purpose, as if they were alive. The teenagers huddled together, fear gripping their hearts as the shadows closed in. And then they heard it, a low rumbling sound like distant thunder. It grew louder, reverberating through the building, shaking the walls and rattling the windows. The sound built to a deafening roar, and the air filled with the smell of smoke and burning wood. The cinema was reliving the fire. The shadows swirled around them, growing darker and more solid with each passing second. The teenagers screamed as the room began to fill with smoke, the heat intensifying. They could feel the flames licking at their skin, hear the crackling of burning wood, and the distant screams of the trapped patrons. But just as the terror reached its peak, the shadows suddenly withdrew, disappearing as quickly as they had come. The smoke cleared, the heat dissipated, and the lights flickered back to life. The lobby was empty, the doors wide open, the night air beckoning them to escape. They didn't need any further encouragement. The teenagers bolted out of the cinema, racing down Main Street without looking back. The cursed reel, the phantom projectionist, the shadows, all of it was left behind, locked within. The terror that had gripped the teenagers in the Ash Grove cinema spread quickly through the town, fueling a firestorm of rumors and fear. Their frantic escape and the tales they told afterward were enough to convince even the most skeptical residents that the cinema was indeed cursed. The once vibrant building now stood as a dark silhouette against the town's skyline, its windows like hollow eyes staring out over Ash Grove, daring anyone to come closer. In the days that followed, a series of strange occurrences plagued the town. The townspeople reported hearing faint screams and crackling sounds in the dead of night, as if the fire that had consumed the cinema all those years ago was burning again. Some claimed to see ghostly figures wandering the streets near the cinema, their forms barely visible through the haze of smoke that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Others spoke of an oppressive heat that would suddenly descend upon them, followed by a bone-chilling cold. The worst of these manifestations occurred late at night, when the town was at its quietest. It was then that the ghosts of the past seemed most active, reliving the tragic events of the fire in an endless loop. Windows in nearby houses rattled as if struck by powerful gusts of wind, though the air outside remained still. The scent of burning wood and charred fabric drifted on the breeze, a stark reminder of the lives lost in the inferno. Desperate for answers, the townspeople turned to the local historian, Eleanor Grayson. Eleanor was one of the few who remembered the original cinema before it was consumed by flames, and she had spent years researching the fire and its aftermath. She was well versed in the town's history and the dark secrets that had been buried with it. Eleanor was an elderly woman, her sharp mind undulled by age. She lived alone in a house filled with old books and yellowed photographs, relics of Ash Grove's past. When the teenagers came to her, pale and shaken by their experience, she listened intently, her expression grave. She had feared something like this would happen when the new cinema was built, but she had hoped that the spirits would remain at peace. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "Don't leave out a single detail." The teenagers recounted their harrowing experience, the cursed reel, the phantom projectionist, and the shadows that had nearly claimed them. As they spoke, Eleanor's frown deepened, her mind working through the implications of their story. When they finished, she remained silent for a long time, lost in thought. Finally, she spoke, her voice heavy with the weight of what she was about to reveal. "The Ash Grove cinema fire was no accident," she began, her eyes narrowing as she recalled the events of that fateful night. "The official story is that faulty wiring sparked the blaze, but there was more to it than that, much more. The fire was the result of a curse, one that was set in motion long before the cinema was ever built. The teenagers exchanged uneasy glances, the room growing colder as Eleanor continued. In the early 1900s, before the cinema was constructed, there was a series of mysterious deaths in the town. People would simply drop dead without warning, their faces twisted in terror, as if they had seen something unspeakable. The town was in a panic, and no one could explain the deaths. It wasn't until a drifter, a man who claimed to be a medium, came to town that the cause was discovered. Eleanor paused, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. The drifter said that the town was cursed, that the land itself was tainted by an ancient evil. He claimed that the deaths were the work of vengeful spirits bound to the earth by some terrible crime committed long ago. The only way to appease the spirits, he said, was to offer them a sacrifice, something of great value, something that would bind their wrath. The teenagers listened in rapt silence, their fear growing with each word. The town leaders, desperate to end the deaths, decided to build the cinema on the cursed ground, hoping that it would placate the spirits. They believed that the joy and life brought by the cinema would counteract the darkness that lay beneath. But they were wrong. Instead of appeasing the spirits, the construction of the cinema only angered them further. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper, her eyes haunted by the memories of what came next. On the night of the fire, the spirits were unleashed. They claimed the lives of everyone inside the cinema, trapping their souls in the building. The curse was never lifted and the spirits were never at rest. When the new cinema was built on the same site, it stirred up the old curse, bringing the spirits back to life. The teenagers felt a chill run down their spines, the gravity of Eleanor's words sinking in. They had unknowingly unleashed something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. "So what can we do?" Tommy asked, his voice trembling with fear. "How do we stop this?" Eleanor sighed, her gaze distant. The spirits are trapped in a loop, reliving their final moments over and over again. They are bound to the cinema by the cursed reel, the one that captured their deaths. If the reel is destroyed, it might break the cycle, but it won't be easy. The spirits will not let it go without a fight. She looked at them, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. "If you're going to do this, you must be prepared for the consequences. The spirits are powerful, and they are angry. This won't be like the movies. This is real, and it's dangerous." The teenagers exchanged nervous glances, the weight of the task before them heavy on their shoulders. But they knew they couldn't back down now. The fate of the town rested on their shoulders, and they were the only ones who could stop the curse. "We'll do it," Tommy said finally, his voice steady. "We'll destroy the reel." Eleanor nodded, though her expression remained grave. "Very well. But remember this. The spirits are bound to the cinema, and they will do everything in their power to stop you. You must be brave, and you must be strong. If you falter, they will take you, just as they took those before you." As the teenagers left Eleanor's house, the sky darkened with storm clouds, the wind picking up as if in response to the storm that was about to descend upon Ashgrove. They knew that the final confrontation was coming, and that the fate of the town, perhaps even their lives, would be decided in the battle to come. That night, as the wind howled and the first drops of rain began to fall, the echoes of the inferno grew louder, the ghostly flames roaring to life within the walls of the Ashgrove cinema. The spirits of the dead stirred, sensing the coming challenge, their wrath ready to be unleashed upon those who dared to defy them. The final act was about to begin. The storm that had been brewing all day finally broke over Ashgrove as night fell, the wind howling through the deserted streets and rain lashing against windows like cold fingers. The town seemed to hold its breath. the oppressive weight of the cursed cinema looming over it like a dark cloud. Inside their homes, the townspeople huddled together, fearful of what the night might bring. They could feel it in their bones, the sense that something terrible was about to unfold. In the dead of night, Tommy, Lisa, Brian, and the others gathered at the edge of Main Street, their faces pale but determined. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would enter the Ashgrove Cinema one last time, retrieve the cursed film reel, and destroy it. Eleanor had told them that only by burning the reel in the exact spot where the original cinema had burned could they hope to break the curse and free the spirits trapped within. Armed with flashlights, a can of gasoline, and a box of matches, the group approached the cinema, the building's dark facade seeming to swallow them whole as they drew near. The neon lights that once proudly advertised the films were long dead, and the marquee was empty, the letters faded and worn. The only sound was the rain drumming against the pavement and the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. They pried open the side door with a crowbar, just as they had before, and slipped inside. The interior was even more oppressive than they remembered, the air thick with the smell of smoke and decay. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the rows of empty seats, the dust motes swirling in the beams of light like restless spirits. As they made their way through the lobby and up to the projection room, a deep sense of dread settled over them. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, seemed to be a warning, a reminder that they were trespassing on cursed ground. When they reached the projection room, they found it just as they had left it, the old projector still sitting in the center of the room like a sentinel from another era. The cursed reel was there too, resting on the table waiting for them. But as Tommy reached for it, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around them like a dark, malevolent fog. A low, rumbling sound filled the room, building in intensity until it became a deafening roar. The projector sprang to life on its own, the reel spinning wildly as the film began to play. The images on the screen were chaotic, flickering between scenes of the cinema before the fire and the horrific events that followed. The ghosts of the patrons appeared on the screen, their faces twisted in terror, their screams echoing through the room as if they were trapped in the film itself. Suddenly, the shadowy figures they had seen before began to materialize in the room, taking on more solid forms. The spirits of the dead were no longer just flickers of light and shadow. They were fully present, their ghostly bodies radiating a cold that cut to the bone. They moved toward the teenagers, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, their mouths open in silent screams. "Get the reel, now," Tommy shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of sounds. Brian grabbed the reel, his hands shaking as he held the cursed object that had caused so much suffering. The others surrounded him, their flashlights flickering as the spirits closed in. But as they turned to leave, the door to the projection room slammed shut, trapping them inside. The projector continued to run, the images on the screen growing more distorted and nightmarish. Flames began to lick at the edges of the screen, the fire from that tragic night coming to life once more. The room grew hotter, the air thick with smoke, and the spirits grew more aggressive, their forms shifting and writhing as they tried to prevent the group from escaping. "We have to burn it now," Lisa cried, panic rising in her voice. Tommy fumbled with the gasoline can, his hands slick with sweat. He poured it over the reel, the pungent smell filling the room. Brian struck a match, his fingers trembling, and dropped it onto the reel. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the film burst into flames, the fire spreading rapidly across the celluloid. The spirits shrieked in fury, their forms flickering violently as the flames consumed the reel. The walls of the projection room shook, and the floor began to crack, as if the very foundation of the building was crumbling. The projector sputtered and died, the screen going dark, but the fire continued to burn, spreading to the walls and ceiling. "We've got to get out of here!" Tommy shouted, kicking at the door with all his strength. The wood splintered and the door finally gave way, opening just enough for them to escape. They ran through the burning building, the flames chasing them as they made their way down the stairs and into the lobby. The spirits were all around them, their cries of anguish and rage echoing through the halls. But the fire seemed to be weakening them, their forms growing less solid with each passing second. The group burst through the front doors and into the pouring rain, gasping for breath as they collapsed on the wet pavement. Behind them, the cinema was engulfed in flames, the fire raging out of control. The spirits' screams grew louder, then suddenly stopped, as if they had been silenced all at once. The group watched in stunned silence as the Ashgrove cinema burned, the flames reaching high into the night sky. The building that had once been a symbol of the town's pride and joy was now a blazing inferno, its dark legacy finally coming to an end. As the fire consumed the cinema, the rain began to fall harder, as if the heavens themselves were trying to extinguish the cursed flames. The townspeople, drawn by the fire and the strange noises, began to gather on Main Street, watching in awe as the cinema burned to the ground. They stood in silence, a mixture of fear and relief on their faces, as the building that had haunted their town for decades was reduced to ashes. When the fire finally died down, all that was left of the Ashgrove cinema was a smoldering ruin. The cursed reel was gone, destroyed in the flames, and with it, the spirits that had been trapped within its frames. The curse was broken, the spirits finally at rest, and the town of Ashgrove was free from the darkness that had plagued it for so long. Tommy, Lisa, Brian, and the others stood in the rain, their clothes soaked through, their bodies exhausted but their hearts light. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, though the memories of what they had seen and done would stay with them for the rest of their lives. As they walked away from the ruins of the cinema, the first rays of dawn began to break through the clouds, casting a warm golden light over the town. The storm had passed, and with it, the curse that had hung over Ashgrove for so many years. The town was quiet, peaceful, as if it were finally able to breathe again. The final curtain had fallen, and the ghosts of the past were gone, leaving Ashgrove to build a new future free from the shadows of the inferno.